Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for day 2 of our budget week. Tonight, we will be talking about the Public Safety Department portion of our budget. I would like to introduce those who are here with me tonight. We have Deputy Mayor Susan Lee. We have Barbara West, Deputy Superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, and Annastasia Walker, Executive Director of the Public Safety Administration Department. Thank you all for being here with me tonight as we have these conversations. As an introduction, the city's public safety departments include the Chicago Police Department, the Chicago Fire Department, the Office of Emergency Management and Communications, the Civilian Office for Police Accountability, the Police Board, and the newly created Office of Public Safety Administration. I'm going to spend a quick couple minutes giving an overview of each of these departments' budgets. For those who want to follow along, the data and graphics for our discussion can be found at chicago.gov/budget dashboard. You should be able to pull up each one of these budgets to see a little more detail around what I will be going over. So let's start with the fire department. CFD's budget for 2020, as you can see here, is $674 million. They are funded across 4 funds, as we like to call it here in the city, corporate fund, grant fund, as well as the 2 airport funds. 90% of this budget, if you see the graphic there, is for personnel costs. Most of the personnel costs are attributed to firefighters and EMTs. Number-wise, 3,300 of this personnel, or 64% of that personnel, are firefighters or EMTs. The city has 96 neighborhood firehouses across the city and 80 ambulances. Next up is the Office of Emergency Management and Communications. OEMC is also funded across 5 different funds, which includes the Emergency Communications Fund, grant funds, corporate funds, as well as both airport funds. OEMC's mission is really, they manage the day-to-day operations, which includes traffic control, as well as emergency operations, such as deploying resources for emergency incidents, such as storms that we recently have, or as well our COVID-19 response. They are also probably most well known for managing the 911 and 311 centers here for the city. In 2020, their budget, as I said, was more than $200 million. Now, what you'll see here is that they are primarily funded through the Emergency Communication Fund. The revenue for that fund actually comes from everyone's, if you see on your cell phone bill, there's a $5 surcharge for emergency communications, and that is really what is funding our 911 operations, as well as our emergency response functions. Next are COPA and the Police Board, which are primarily 2 of the city's police accountability departments. The Police Board reviews disciplinary cases. They resolve matters in which COPA and the Superintendent of Police do not agree regarding discipline. They host public meetings for members of the public to present questions and comments to the board. And most recently, as part of their, within their ordinance, the Superintendent of Police, they nominate candidates for the superintendent to the mayor. The Civilian Office of Police Accountability, or COPA, conducts investigations of police misconduct. They identify and address patterns of police misconduct and make policy recommendations to improve CPD with the goal of reducing incidents of police misconduct. Also, per the municipal code, COPA's annual budget must be no less than 1% of the annual appropriation of all non-grant funds for the Chicago Police Department. Lastly, the largest portion of the city's public safety budgets is the Chicago Police Department. In 2020, their budget totaled $1.7 billion, which was funded across 5 different funds. We're going to spend a little bit of time here because we've gotten a lot of questions around CPD's budget, digging a little bit further into what makes up this $1.7 billion. As you can see on that chart, 90%, nearly 90% of the police budget is made up of personnel, with the remaining 11% for non-personnel. Of the more than 14,000 positions budgeted in CPD, more than 10,000 are police officers. Most people are familiar with the patrol section of CPD, but there are many other functions around the police department. Deputy Superintendent, did you want to maybe break down a little bit of some of the other functions within the police department outside of patrol?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, you know, as the top of our department is the superintendent, and within his section, he has the Labor Affairs Division, the Legal Affairs Division, as well as the Bureau of Internal Affairs, as also the Office of Community Policing. We're then pretty much divided up into two different offices. The Office of Operations, which is led by the first Deputy Superintendent, has 3 bureau chiefs underneath him, one being the Bureau of Patrol, the other being the Bureau of Detectives, of course, who handle follow-up investigations, and then the Bureau of Counterterrorism. That bureau is made up of the airport, public transportation, as well as K-9, SWAT, etc. That would be that bureau. On the other side would be me. I lead the Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform, which is made up of the Training Division, the Professional Counseling Division, as well as the Reform Management Group. The Reform Management Group handles most of the consent decree work and made up of the risk management section, research and development, as well as just project management office.
Great. So really around the budget, this chart really is providing a little more detail about what is really entailed in both personnel and non-personnel costs. As you see on the left side of the screen, those are all the different lines across CPD's budgets, across all the funds, that really make up that 89%, which I said at the beginning, which make up all of the personnel charges. Obviously, most of that is for salary and wages for the various personnel within the department. On the non-personnel side, as you can see on the right-hand side, is really the 11% that make up all of those non-personnel costs. Of that, you know, a good portion of that, if you see at the top of the chart, is really around the settlements and judgment costs for CPD. So, you know, really, there's not a lot on the non-personnel side outside of, you know, settlements and judgments. Some of the other lines are smaller, and again, you know, a lot of the what's behind that budget is really personnel. Lastly, before we get into some questions, here you can see the CPD position count since 2011. What you'll see is, you know, there was an increase around 2018 and 19. This was due to the 2-year hiring surge that the department went through previously, but last year the position count did decrease by about 250. So you'll see historically on this chart, you know, the total number of budgeted personnel within the department. So we've received a lot of questions around CPD's plan and what the city's plan is around police reform. So here's one that we received from Laura Singer. What reforms are you proposing to reduce police brutality? So, you know, I think CPD's budget has been getting a lot of attention, definitely as we begin discussions around the 2020 budget, the 2021 budget. So let me send that to Deputy Mayor Lee to kind of talk through some of our investments and reforms.
Thanks, Susie. So I think the reform measures in CPD are largely and primarily driven by the consent decree, which went into effect in 2019. It is a large document of over 200 pages with nearly 800 paragraphs for compliance. 2 of the most important areas are transparency and accountability, and as well as community policing, training, and policy reform. It pretty much covers all of the areas of CPD operation designed to really build trust in the community, but also legitimacy of CPD in the community. I think it's also very important to note that the consent decree goes further than just CPD and involves many other agencies, including OEMC, COPA, Police Board, and has several things that fall under the mayor's office jurisdiction as well. And so we coordinate across city departments to comply with the consent decree. And just finally, I think beyond the consent decree, both the mayor and the superintendent have talked about it being a floor rather than a ceiling. And so there are many other reform initiatives, which I think many of which the Deputy Superintendent will talk about.
Right, sure. Thank you, Susan. I'd like to speak specifically about use of force. So, you know, given any year now, all of our officers are required to have a minimum of 8 hours of use of force training each year. And that has been a plan that we've been moving forward. In this year, we were all required to have 32 hours of in-service training. In terms of use of force policy, you know, we have a working group established in terms of getting input from the community, in terms of revising our use of force policy, which will then be put into our next year's training for use of force. We do now have, we stood up in 2019 the Force Review Division, which takes a look at a random sample of use of force reports, and they're looking at those reports for training or tactical or equipment needs and things. They also take a look at our foot pursuit incidents. They take a look at our firearm pointing incidents, and now there have actually been challenged or staffed to take a look at our Fourth Amendment stops in terms of that. We also have accountability dashboards that Susan kind of mentioned about. There is now accountability dashboards in terms of any kind of misconduct that's reported. It is a clear dashboard that anyone can actually view, as well as a use of force dashboard that's up on our public website. In terms of some of the other initiatives that police department has done in terms of community policing, so we have established, you know, the neighborhood policing initiative, which is being rolled out in other districts this year. The 9th, the 10th, the 11th district are going to be receiving those programs, and they are going through an extensive training. One of the trainings that they will be receiving is a community-based training where community members are actually going to be teaching our officers about the assets and the migration patterns, et cetera, of the communities that they will be serving in. We also currently have the Ppo Immersion program, which is going to be taking place when officers come off of their probation. They'll be immersed with a community-based organization where they'll receive training from that organization. We're also doing that for our in-service members as well. So those are just some of the community policing initiatives we've done. We've also hired for the first time, we have a language access coordinator. That member has been brought on to deal with our training as well as our policy development, ensuring that we are reaching all the communities with limited English proficiencies and other members who may have other communication needs. We also have hired our first assistant, American with Disabilities Act coordinator. That individual has been brought on this year as well. These are just a few of the things that we're doing in reform.
Thank you. So in addition to all of these initiatives, this year we also created the Office of Public Safety Administration. Executive Director Walker, can you tell us some things about PSA and what some of your goals are?
Of course. Thank you, Susie. The Office of Public Safety Administration is responsible for the planning and execution of the administrative functionality for our 3 departments, which are OEMC, the Chicago Fire Department, and the Chicago Police Department. Shared services is a trend that many local governments are implementing across the country, and for the city of Chicago, that means us taking a look at efficiencies in finance, IT, HR, and things of that nature. And so that's what we're going to be responsible for, looking at efficiencies from everything from paper clips to cars.
Great. All right, we've received more than 200 questions through our website, so thank you to everyone out there that submitted questions. Of these, 76 were all about public safety, and many of our questions have been about defunding the police. So we're going to go through some of those questions and maybe have a conversation around that. So from Isabel Thompson, the Chicago Police Department does not keep me safe. They threaten my safety. Why do you, the budget director, seek to put so much money into a police department and so little money into human services? The police do not prevent violence, they perpetuate it. Why not prevent violence and harm by investing in healthcare, housing, and education for all communities, not just the ones with high property values? Next, from Nathan Pease. The tightening of a police department's budget is not a bad idea, as the current allocations are wasteful and not providing police with proper training to de-escalate dangerous situations. The FOP has a toxic influence and has actively endangered the citizens of the city. Will the budget redirect money towards actual crime prevention services such as social services, youth services, housing, education, healthcare, and other community resources? From Victoria Grace, why has the mayor not reduced funding for the police and increased funding for community-based social services that target and reduce crime? Obviously, this is a very important topic. We've heard definitely a lot about that over the last several weeks. I know that there's a lot of questions that have come up recently as we've talked about our budget forecast and as we're moving towards the 2021 budget. So let's have that conversation. Deputy Mayor Lee, if you want to start off, and then we can definitely add on.
Sure, and so I think this is really the question of the day, although I think there have been many who have called for this off and on for the past few years. It really came to the fore with the murder of George Floyd, and people really righteously and rightfully questioning the role of police in our communities, and are they in fact adding to public safety in light of some of the cases of police brutality. I think that it's really a question that we have to ponder intentionally and carefully in this time. I think that there is a real important question that we have to answer, which is that after decades of defunding some of the really basic safety net services around mental health, social services, family support services, we are asking our police to respond to all kinds of crises. And is there a better way to respond to some calls for help that is not about violent crime or violence? And that is a question we must answer, but must do so in a careful way, particularly because we are faced with an unprecedented level of violence this year. Homicides and shootings are up. Although we are sort of experiencing a decline in the rate, we are still having too much violence in our communities, and police have to respond. I also want to just point out that I think this is not a black and white, one or the other type of question. I think this is about having both effective and legitimate policing, which is a necessary component of a comprehensive approach, while also thinking about what other services do we need to build up so that the communities feel healthy and safe in their own neighborhoods. And so I want to get away from this idea that it's one or the other, but in fact it is really all of those things together working seamlessly that's going to bring us to safety.
Yep, and I agree with you. I think, we've had a lot of discussion around this, and I know we'll continue to have it, that it's really not an either or. I get a lot of questions about, defunding, but, as we went through the budget, 89% of the CPD's budget is personnel. It's really going to come through. It's not really about taking money away from some of the non-personnel, which is a small portion of that budget, but it comes down to people. And given all this time and all the stuff that's going on, is this the right time to also decrease the number of officers, in the budget? And where are those funds going to come from? So I think that's part of this discussion. We don't have the answer today, but I think as we're pondering and having these discussions, that's also part of that is, where are we defunding the police? It's not just about that, but, is it people? Do we reduce the number of police given all the stuff that's going out there?
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about the one or the other. I think the police bring about a sense of public safety. When you have public safety in an area, people tend to want to move to that location. They want to bring their business. They want to grow. They want to see the investments there. But just like we were speaking about earlier, in terms of training, that's why it's important for officers to have the critical training that they need. That's why our officers are receiving crisis intervention training to respond to some of those things. That's why our officers are actually receiving just basic mental health training so that they can be aware of something that they may be seeing and they're not familiar with, and they can call for a crisis intervention trained officer. That's why it's significantly important for us to invest in training for them on an annual basis so that, we've been training our officers to, chokeholds are not authorized unless deadly force is, and about positional asphyxia. So we have those kind of things in our training. So it's currently, it's not one or the other, but it's got to be a level of both.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think, some of that, we've started to build on those investments in this last budget. As you know, we did increase funding, definitely as an investment around violence prevention, around mental health, which we also know, and the mayor believes strongly that is an important investment that we need to make. So it's it's not the either or. It's, how do we get the investments where they're needed, while also, I think it's not lost upon definitely me as the budget director that, even with the consent decree, that also costs money, right? We want to make, it's really about where are we making the right investments, because the consent decree, as you saw, there's staff that's needed, there's additional training that's needed, there's programs that are needed to also, get the police department, where they need to be around that too. So those all, there's dollars around that. So it's really about, where are those investments best made, and to continue that conversation. Okay, the next second favorite topic is police overtime. So that's also been talked about a lot. So, I've gotten a lot of questions. Obviously, the city's balancing overtime management with all the things, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's some of the, violence that's going on here in the city. I will start off and then obviously pass it to both of you. In terms of the dollars. So, we did start off the year doing well in overtime. We did Cpd's budget is almost $95 million. To date, through July, I believe we have hit that. So I understand the reality of that. The forecast that we have put out does understand that, and we have, anticipated what the increased overtime is going to be for the police department. But I did want to talk about that. We get a lot of questions about police overtime. There was always we've done a lot of work with the police. I think, the superintendent came in and said, anyone deputy chief and above needs to be approving that. I think there were processes in place. But given, all the stuff that's also happening, we need to be cognizant of that as well, and where the priorities are there. So.
Yeah, I just want to say these are some unprecedented times. I don't think anybody's managed through a global pandemic, a civil unrest at the level that we are seeing, and of course all the pain that comes from the economic downturn we're seeing as well. And as a result of those things, all of those things together, we're also seeing increased violence. And I am acutely aware as the Deputy Mayor of Public Safety, the kind of sacrifices that we have asked from officers to be out there constantly, and many times on 12-hour days or their days off canceled. And so the overtime management and overtime cost is reflecting all of that is going on. And we are going to work towards definitely managing and controlling overtime. But I just have to acknowledge that these are some unprecedented times, and we are asking a lot of our officers who are out there.
Yeah, I just want to echo that, Susie, you brought up that earlier this year we're doing, we're on track to be well below our allotted $95 million for the year. And given that all of our command staff had received training from your office in terms of these are how you manage your budgets, and following those instructions, we did reduce our overtime. We elevated, as you said, the level of the approval of an overtime from a actual lieutenant to a deputy chief, which is a significant leveling up to ensure that we were not using overtime in any kind of way that was not justifiable. And that the fact that, again, these are different times that I've experienced in my career on this job in over 27 years. I've never seen the actual civil unrest unfold and the looting throughout our cities and the increase in gun violence simultaneously happening. And then, the pandemic, of course.
Right.
So
it's unique times for sure. Okay, my third favorite question is the question around police retirements. So we've gotten also a lot of questions that that the retirements are very high, and so I did want to clarify a little bit of kind of what we're seeing. Obviously, we still have the rest of the next 4 months to go. To date, I believe we have about 444 retirements across all the sworn ranks. To me, looking at historically, this is not the highest it's been. I think, we have been at this level in previous years. So, I did want to put that out there too, that, to date, what we've seen is not out of the ordinary. And that given, what's happening. I think, we also just recently settled the contract for our sergeants, lieutenants, and captains. So I just wanted to answer that question.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to, I track the numbers as well, Susie. We've had multiple conversations about our attrition rates. And so these are just normal numbers, as you know. We always know this in advance, right? So the year before, we have a estimate of, FOP members who have to put in their application for retirement as of October the 1st of any given year. And so we kind of know these numbers. I can kind of track and let you know, well, we're expecting a few more for the remainder of the year, but not substantially a lot. So these are normal numbers for us.
Great. All right. Question from Eddie Bocanegra. I'm sorry if I... Bocanegra, thank you. How can the city be more efficient with other city departments to help reduce violence? In addition, what metrics are we using to justify the dollars that go into our police and community interventions? Susan, did you want to?
So I think that this has been a really productive year in city under Mayor Lightfoot to bring not just CPD or even the public safety agencies, but really all departments to be accountable to reducing violence. And probably the best way to talk about that is the Public Safety Cabinet, which meets regularly to talk about how city agencies can coordinate and collaborate around violence reduction. We have done this now twice around summer violence particularly, but obviously when COVID hit, we have been meeting more frequently really to discuss how it is that all departments contribute. We also activated the Summer Operations Center this summer, which meant that on a kind of weekend by weekend basis, departments like Streets and Sand, CDOT, and Water Management are all contributing their assets to helping CPD, OEMC, and Fire Department to manage the both the level of unrest that might be happening in any specific locations, but also just the level of violence that we have seen in neighborhoods and everywhere else. And so I think we are working more efficiently. Obviously, there's more to do to improve our coordination. In terms of community-based intervention, I think that it is really important to know that this is a very data-driven administration here, and so all community interventions that are being funded by the mayor's commitment to violence reduction are being evaluated by research institutions. Obviously, we don't have results yet because we are just now getting going, but I did want to put that out there that we are very much a data-driven and want to hold ourselves accountable for having results and impact on violence reduction.
Great, okay. This year, the Chicago Police Department's budget totaled $1.68 billion, which equates to $5 million spent on policing every day. How do you justify spending only $9 million towards violence prevention programs? Why are we seeing an increase in the CPD budget of 7% at a time when the city is facing budget shortfalls? So I'm going to clarify just some of the budget numbers, and then Susan, I'll have you talk a little bit about the violence prevention program. So last year, CPD's budget had only two increases. One of it was an increase to the settlements and judgments line, which we committed to funding as it needed to be. So we did increase the settlements and judgments line within the police department budget. And the only other increase there was the increase because we had settled our sergeants, lieutenants, and captains contract was what we were contractually required and had agreed to do. So those were the only two increases last year in CPD's budget. But in terms of the investment into violence prevention, I did want to clarify, we did in the 2020 budget put $9 million there, but we also recently, through the funding that we received for CARES Act, did add another $10 million to violence prevention with the increase due to COVID. So.
Right, and I think that's a historic investment, and I want to be a little bit in the weeds on this because I think when people talk about violence prevention or violence intervention, there's a lot of confusion about what those programs mean. And I think traditionally the city has invested into prevention type of programs like after school or summer jobs or mentoring and so on and so forth. But we have really not done a lot of investment into violence intervention, which is working with those folks who are really in the thick of violence, who might be victims, who might be potential shooters, and making sure that there are support systems and interventions there to interrupt the cycle of violence. And in many large cities like Los Angeles and New York, and even smaller ones like Oakland, have relied on violence intervention, the interruption with those who are in the thick of violence, as a strategy and have seen success. And so the really important thing about the investment that the mayor has made into violence intervention in 2020 and moving forward again with CARES dollars and increasing it is we are focusing on that piece of the strategy, which is violence intervention, and then certainly coordinating with a lot of the prevention efforts that have existed. And so to me, this is a strategic investment to increase that capacity in the community that experience violence the most, and making sure that that gap that exists in those communities are being filled, and hopefully we can grow. I think the other really important thing to point out is that for the last few years, philanthropy and county and state and the city have been becoming more aligned around this strategy. And so what we're seeing is that this violence infrastructure, violence prevention infrastructure in the community is growing stronger and more sustainable, and we hope to continue that trend.
That's great. Juliet Roll has asked, how often does the Public Safety Committee across the departments meet? So I don't know, Susan, if you want to start. I know we often have conversations across city departments. I know this is part of the planning that you do.
So the Public Safety Cabinet, which is made up of more than 30 of the agencies across the city, meet on a quarterly basis, but there are also work going on in between quarterly meetings. So for example, in January, we kicked off planning for summer violence with the Public Safety Cabinet. And between that meeting and the meeting that happened in the next quarter, the departments were charged with coming up with initiatives that would help towards reducing violence in the neighborhoods that were identified by CPD as hotspots, and making sure that there was communication and coordination. And then middle of the summer, when we meet again, we are reviewing kind of what those coordination efforts have been, making some course corrections if necessary. And then certainly when we meet at the end of the year, we're evaluating the outcomes of those efforts. And so this is an ongoing effort across city departments. And so we meet quarterly, but there's work going on throughout the year.
Okay, a question from Everline Talbert. In January 2020, I purchased a house in the historic Jackson Park Highland neighborhood of South Shore. I loved the neighborhood. My main concern is the gun violence in the neighborhood. Since the spring, there are always gun shootings weekly near my house, and it has increased this summer. In the 2021 budget, will there be funding to provide community-based training for police officers to better deal with de-escalating violence? I'm going to send that question over to Deputy Chief Superintendent.
All right, thank you, Susie. So, you know, this year we've actually started many of the initiatives. So with My Block, My Hood, My City, you know, our recruits have been going out to do neighborhood tours with this young group, the youth-led tours. The youth are actually displaying their neighborhood over in the Ogden, North Lawndale area, and they're walking them through the showing them their, you know, farmers market, and showing them the store where they go get hamburgers and cheeseburgers at, and they're showing them where Martin Luther King actually lived when he was doing the walks and things in Chicago. And so that's just one of the initiatives. I think I found myself going out there a couple times to enjoy that program with them and meeting with the youth and find out how their summer went. The second program we're going to be doing is the Ppo Immersion. So after a PPO has finished with their training cycle, they will be able to go in and work with a community organization who will be training them, showing them the assets in that community. That's going to be dealing with, you know, the history of that neighborhood, the migration patterns that happen on the north and west and south sides. And so that's just two of the programs that we're doing in terms of now and not waiting for the 2021 budget.
Great. Okay. A question from Rachel McDonnell. On the topic of violence prevention, I believe the most effective models have shown that an increase in human services leads to a decrease in violence and recidivism. Will you commit to shifting funds from the public safety section of the budget to human services section to ensure that youth services, homeless support, mental health care, and workforce development do not see any austerity cuts during this difficult financial period? This is what citizens across the city have been requesting in the streets, in messages to our aldermen, and in pleas to the mayor's office. Our human services are already drastically underfunded. They should not be subject to any austerity measures at this time. They are more essential than ever. So thank you for that question. I think, I could definitely start around, a lot of the work that we're doing. I know that given the size of our gap, there's going to be a lot of discussion around, what measures we need to take, what cuts we'll need to make, as well as investments. While I cannot guarantee anything today, I think that I'm very aware of the different needs across the city. Right now, every department we are going through, whether it's the police department, whether it's DFSS, across the city, to really look through, what the priorities are. If we can make reductions, where are they? While keeping in mind, what are some of the priorities and the services that our residents expect. So there's definitely more to come on that. We're going to keep all of these comments that we get in mind as we do our outreach, and definitely as we hear from all of our residents of, what's most important to them. Question from Alex Facey. What is the planned budget for CPD in 2021? Is it going down from 2020? If not, why not? So I could definitely start. Again, we are currently building the 2021 budget, so we do not yet know what CPD's final budget will be for next year. So like I said, CPD is going to be no different than every other department we're working through here in the city as we go through and prioritize, what is essential. We're going to work to close this gap that we have that we just announced. So again, that's a lot of the work that we're going through right now. So we should have a better answer several weeks from now. Question from Cassandra Sneed. What is the plan for the remainder of the year for those areas affected by the higher crime rates and really Chicago in general?
Oh, thank you for that question. So, as you know, the superintendent, when he came in, he looked at our department in terms of what our reorganization actually looked like, and he said, what, I want to take it one step farther. And he put together these two citywide teams, one being the critical incident response team, and then the other being the community safety teams. With the initiation of them about 5 weeks ago, we've actually seen declines in terms of the number of murders and the number of shootings that we've had in the city. As we continue to go through this year, we're going to continue to work with all the organizations in the city in terms of public safety, in terms of bringing in other assets to help and assist us with this, as well as our community partners and our community-based organizations, and that will be the strategy for the remainder of the year.
Thank you for that. All right. Waiting for our next question. Okay, question from Anthony Morietto. Why do we continue to funnel more money into police departments while the wrongful convictions, injury, and death from police cost us more and more every year? What is the incentive to pay more for police when that just means the wrongful conviction/accusation cases will pile up that much faster? How can you burn the taxpayers at both ends and hold accountability to police unions, departments, and officers for their inability to quell crime in this city? I'm going to send that over to you, Susan.
Sure. So, when we talk about accountability, there's the front end accountability and then there's the back end accountability. So front end accountability is really, do you have the right policies, right training, so that the officers are well equipped to handle the situation that come their way in a constitutional way and procedurally just way, so that they are legitimate actors in the community. And I think that's what consent decree is really helping us to to do, which is to set the right policies in place, right training in place, so the officers are well equipped. So we are on our way in doing that. I think the back end accountability is really holding somebody accountable when they've done something wrong or misconduct happens. And Chicago really has a robust accountability system with both the internal affairs within CPD, but also a civilian oversight through COPA, which does the investigations of misconduct, some of the misconduct, and then police board that adjudicates these discipline cases. And then, of course, we have the consent decree. And so we have a really robust structures in place for accountability. Now, have they always worked well? I think that's partly why the accountability section of the consent decree is so robust and so many paragraphs are devoted to it, is so that our systems can improve and work seamlessly to make sure that the kinds of high level of settlements and litigation and other types of accusations are reduced over time. And so we are going to get there, but we are really at the beginning of this journey for improving our accountability.
I just wanted to add to that too in terms of accountability. So, you know, we've become more transparent in our department, right? And so we've created these dashboards, one being how, you know, how to file complaints against an officer if you choose to different mechanisms to do that, but also how many complaints are out there and open on an officer, how many have been sustained. I think those are the things that, you know, in the past we never had this transparency in terms of our department. Another thing we're doing in terms of risk management, looking at the things that we need to address before they become issues, is something that we've now had the ability to do with a new risk management officer in our department, looking at our policies, our procedures. Are there things that we need to see and change before an issue arises, so we're ahead as opposed to being reactive.
Right, and I know you're also working with the risk management officer in the mayor's office to really bring that full circle as well.
I also want to address that part of the question around police unions. As a lot of folks know, we've had a historic decision, an arbitration decision with the PUPA around accountability measures, including allowing anonymous complaints and record keeping and many of the things that we have been wanting to establish. And so we are looking forward to engaging the FOP and making sure that accountability measures continue to be an important part of the contract negotiations.
Great. Okay, next question. Will the city budget for CPAC or GAPA? Did you want to also tell the, say what the acronym is for?
CPAC stands for Citizens Police Accountability Commission, and I think GAPA stands for Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability.
Okay, great.
Both are entities that have been advocating for a civilian oversight structure within the city. As I said in the previous answer to the previous question, we do have a really robust and complex accountability structure in Chicago. However, the mayor has been committed to adding a civilian oversight body that has some meaningful authority over policy making, policy decisions at CPD. And as the point person from the mayor's office, working with GAPA around those proposals, I can tell you that these conversations have been robust and ongoing for the past year. So we are now in the process of figuring out what that structure needs to look like. And obviously, if we establish something, there has to be a budget that goes along with it. Right. And so this is part of the conversations. And as Susie pointed out, budget is in the process of being built. And so we don't have a final answer right now, but it is certainly in the hopper of many discussions.
Great. Question from Lauren Rivas. Why does Chicago value policing over resources for the south and west sides of Chicago?
I think that's really perhaps the way that, well, let me dial back, I guess. The systems of inequity that has been in Chicago for many, many decades have certainly led to a level of hopelessness and deprivation on the south and the west sides of Chicago. I think this mayor has been very clear that her first goal is to do an equitable investment that looks at that history and tries to right it for the benefit of all of Chicago. And that is why I think she has invested in not only violence reduction, which is heavily concentrated on the South and West Side communities, because that's where we're seeing the communities most impacted by violence, but she's also had an intentional investment like Invest Southwest initiative, which is going to generate both economic development in key corridors on the South and the West Side to generate opportunity and jobs and basically bring back some revitalization back to those neighborhoods. And so I think, you know, and Mayor says this a lot, and I know Susie knows this as well, the budget is a values document, and I think given the tough deficit that we were facing last year for 2020, and now even bigger deficit for 2021, we will always be working to reflect the values of this administration, which is that we believe in equity and want to do things in an equitable way so that all of Chicago can thrive.
Absolutely, and I was going to add to that, as we talked about yesterday in yesterday's budget series, is that, you know, we are applying an equity lens as we go through the whole budget. It's something that we have definitely worked through even at the start of the budget process. And to your point, Susan, we're going to continue that as we, you know, make decisions, as we make the hard choices, you know, about what is going to be included in the 2021 budget and what we can do given our gap for next year. That it will always be part of that discussion, though. However. Okay, next question. We've seen that one. Okay, question from Daniel Trinan. City Council has repeatedly stated that defunding is off the table in regards to the CPD's $1.8 billion budget. In light of recent budget shortfalls, I believe it is imperative to revisit that conversation. So I want to clarify, I do not think that City Council has stated that it's off the table per se. I think yesterday Chairman Dow, who is the chair of the Budget and Government Operations, she's the chairwoman of that committee, did state that we were going to have a hearing actually around police budget and to really start those conversations again regarding defunding or prioritizing and kind of where those investments need to go. So again, I did want to clarify that and that also CPD as well as every department, fire, other departments that we have in the city are similarly going to go through that same exercise that we're doing across the budget in terms of prioritization, and what the critical services are for next year. Question from Sandra Jordan. Is there going to be emergency response training available to communities? We had 4 tornadoes touch down on one day here. Mm-hmm. It would be wise to use the community groups. It would be wise to use the community groups to distribute materials that inform people what supplies they need to have and where to go, etc. Thank you for that question. Yes, while we did not expect to have 4 tornadoes here in the city, that is actually a function of our Office of Emergency Management and Communications. As I mentioned early on, one of their functions in that department is really around emergency response. I know from my early OEMC days that there is a CERT team, which I believe is the Community Emergency Response Team, that all residents can volunteer to create and be a part of, and that could help towards having those community groups and inform people about the different things of what to do in an emergency. I recommend, if you are interested in that, to reach out to OEMC. I think on their website they may have additional information around that, and to reach out to them because they can definitely provide more information. What is the post to for? Okay. Do we see this question already? Sorry. Okay, next question is from Iris Song. How is it that we can be spending a disproportionate amount of money on policing, but we somehow do not have money to fund nurses, social workers, or librarians in all CPS schools? So first, to clarify, this budget that we're talking through and all the discussions we're having this week is around the city's budget. The CPS budget, which is one of our sister agencies, similar to CTA or the Park District or City Colleges, all have separate budgets. So, I do want to clarify that, whatever happens here in our budget and the ongoing discussions we have around the police budget do not really affect the public schools budget, which is a separate budget process that I know they're going through right now, which is a separate entity. So I did want to clarify that. The next question is, which organizations receive violence prevention funding, and who is holding them accountable and measuring outcomes?
So I don't want to go through all the organizations, but essentially more than 10 organizations have been funded through the mayor's initiative around violence reduction. Those awards were granted as of May 1st this year, and they involve a mixture of street outreach organizations that are doing case management, reentry services, as well as victim support and trauma interventions. And both of those efforts are being evaluated by a research entity, and will obviously, inform their effectiveness as well as improving their program quality as we move forward. So I think on the mayor's website there is a site for the Office of Violence Reduction, which is where this funding exists, and on that site should be a list of all the organizations as well as a much more robust description of the kinds of services that we have funded and where, importantly.
Great. Question from Max Yenkin. You discussed the consent decree, but CPD missed more than 70% of the deadlines required. How can you point to the consent decree as a success so far when CPD is unable to be held accountable?
So I'll take a stab at that and hold it on to Deputy Superintendent. I do think we are obviously acknowledging that a lot of the deadlines have been missed. I do have to say, having done this work in many jurisdictions, that this consent decree has way more deadlines than probably a typical consent decree, and it's just by structure of the way it was negotiated. And because of the way the consent decree started, which was in March with the appointment of the independent monitor, some of the deadlines sort of preceded that moment of March 1st. And so those are a lot of in the weeds answers to that question. But having seen some really successful implementation of the consent decree, such as the one in LA, what's really important about consent decree is the long-term sustainability of the change that you're trying to achieve. And to get there, you really have to set up the system of both compliance at this moment, but making sure that the changes you make stick in the cultural transformation of the organization. And so I do believe that CPD in the past year particularly have done some really foundational things to achieve not only more immediate compliance, more deadlines met, but also making sure that these changes we're making are sticking and will continue to impact how CPD becomes more legitimate in the communities. And I will point to one really important thing is the massive reorganization that was announced in January, began in February, and to some degree continues to go on right now, is really the emblematic foundational change at CPD that is going to fuel compliance with consent decree to be done in a faster way, in a more efficient way, and a really more impactful way. And the Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform that Deputy Superintendent Barb West is in charge of is really elevated to an equal partner to the operations section, which was never sort of the case in CPD's history. So I point to those foundational elements that were achieved this year as really giving us a lot of hope that we are going to do better and do it in a more efficient way. I don't know if Deputy Superintendent, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add. So with that, you mentioned about the structural reorganization and elevating the position of and creating the Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform. In that, we had to bring all these little pieces that were spread out through the department under one office, and so we could be more effective and function as a group and get things done faster. We've also implemented some changes in our processes, of course, in terms of, now we have, I'm not sure if you're familiar with CompStat, but we have a reform stat process that we go through once a week where we bring in the units who are accountable for the deliverables in the consent decree and have them ask we're asking them a series of questions in terms of where they are with their projects, what do they need to get it done, are there some barriers that we need to remove for them. That reform set meeting is held every Wednesday and is attended by, high-level members of the police department. Myself, the superintendent attends, chief of the operations division, the first deputy, as well as the chief of constitutional policing and reform. So we bring the units in to inquire about the consent decrees. You know, we went back through our monitoring reports, the 1 and 2, and actually set priorities so that we can build the work around the things that we need to catch up on in terms of 1 and 2, and also prioritizing what we need to do for 3 and 4. As Susan mentioned earlier, our consent decree is 800 paragraphs. I'm not comparing us to anyone else, but it is about having consistent reform and having reform that's done right and sustainable reform. I think that, you know, having to build those systems, including having our own auditing division, was something that we didn't have in place in terms of reminding us about our compliance efforts and self-checking ourselves. I think that was something we did that was a little bit different and was at the advice of other organizations who had gone through a consent decree.
Okay, we have time for 3 more questions. Our next one is from Jeanette Pegas. I'm sorry if I am messing up your last names. All of what you're saying sounds good regarding the equity lens and west and south sides, but still, what and when will we actually see for results in the communities that need it so badly?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
You know, the inequities that drive the violence and other deprivation and hopelessness has been constructed over a really long period of time in Chicago. So it is not an issue that came about last year or the year before. It's really decades of inequitable policies, practices, and exclusion, disinvestment. I mean, you name it. It's sort of the history of Chicago that we have to confront and grapple with. And so while we are hopeful and really committed to correcting the wrong and making sure that we're making the right kinds of investments to correct that history of inequity, you know, I think to say next year or tomorrow we're going to see transformational change would make me a liar, I think. I think it's going to take time. I think it's going to take concerted effort from the city, but also all of the other stakeholders and other county and state investments and philanthropy to continue to make this a reality. So, you know, that is not a satisfactory answer for many of the families that are suffering already, but I just want to say that there is commitment and there's intention to address this history of inequity.
I agree, and I think, you know, some of the investments that we started with, you know, that I know we've talked about yesterday and today, with, you know, the mental health, the housing, violence prevention, all the work that I know the mayor feels very strongly about, you know, is the step in the right direction. I know people want to see that happen faster, but like you said, this is many, many years of disinvestment, and we are working towards that. So, you know, we ask for patience, and I know it's going to take time, and we will continue to have that discussion as we move towards the 2021 budget. Can we discuss more how the Office of Public Safety Administration will function and reform public safety in Chicago? So I'm going to send that to our executive director.
I thought I was going to get out of here unscathed. Sure, of course. So the Office of Public Safety Administration is going to be responsible for efficiencies that are non-law enforcement and non-fire suppression. So when you look at shared services, I think one of the biggest goals is to make sure that you don't break anything, right? When our citizens call 911, they're not looking to find out what's on sale. And for the most of them, it's probably a pretty dark day. I have done stints at 911, and I've spent the majority of my time at the fire department, and I have a tremendous respect for the Chicago Police Department. Public safety is a tough act to follow. They do tremendous work. And so the goal of Public Safety Administration will be to look for efficiencies without breaking anything. There's going to be value in the insight that I think the Public Safety Administration brings. The majority of the people that are going to be at the Public Safety Administration have done stints at 2 of the 3 departments.
Agree, right.
I think there's going to be reliability that our department heads will have in the PSA because administrative administrative functionality will be our wheelhouse, and I think that they'll be they will come to rely on us to do the right thing by them. And then the last thing, there's value in simplicity. So all of the 3 departments' functionality have a commonality in they all have to procure things, they all have to hire, they all have IT needs, but they have heavy lifts too. So our job will be to look at the simplicity of those things, see if we can find efficiencies and implement those.
Great. Question from Stephen Logan. Mayor Lightfoot has cited 90% of CPD's budget being personnel and the diversity of newer hires as one of the reasons why defunding the police is off the table. What would be the steps to implement a hiring freeze, halting or slowing the hiring of new officers to replace retiring officers as a way to reduce the police budget without sacrificing diversity? I'll send that last question over to you, Deputy Superintendent.
Right, so you think about it, every day, we're looking at the diversity of our department, and that's something that, I get a screenshot every morning that sends me a report, this is what you look like as a department today, men, women, age groups, etc. So, in terms of replacing our new hires, or replacing our retirees with new hires, we're always looking at how and better ways in terms of recruitment to deal with our diversity hiring. Reaching out to community organizations to assist us with hiring, reaching out to the aldermanic officials, reaching out to different agencies in terms of hiring, and also doing working groups, because we've done that with some of our FOP memberships, as well as some of the affiliation organizations, to try to figure out how do we deal with diversity in our hiring. So I think the continued process of even looking at how we do hire, and I know we'll be working with Annastasia, we were on a call the other day about how we actually do hire and how do we remove barriers for members or individuals coming to seek a job with removing those things, because a lot of people say the hiring process is too long. The steps in the process, how do we improve it? How do we help and give them assistance in actually bringing them on board to that? So I think that would be a way of just making sure that we're reaching out and also removing any barriers that we have in the hiring process.
Great. All right, that makes up our hour. I'd like to thank definitely everyone here on the panel for joining me today. We've gotten a lot of great questions. I think this is a start to a lot of the conversations, and definitely some of the hard conversations that we're going to have as we work towards putting our budget together for 2021. Make sure to join us tomorrow as we will have our Human Services Department here to talk through some of those other services that we talked about today. We will be back here at 6 p.m. and please go to chicago.gov/2021budget to submit your questions. We also have a survey that we have put up as of yesterday to really hear from our residents about what's important to you, so make sure to fill that out. And if you would like to find other ways to participate in the process, please let us know. So thank you again. I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow night. Good night.